I'm very excited to have this panel this afternoon, especially excited to have my very old friend Urvashi Vaid here, who I've been working with and seeing over many decades in our continuing battle for the gay rights movement. Urvashi is one of the leading LGBTQ activists of her generation, an author, a strategist, a consultant, and a writer whose work has bridged grassroots, legal advocacy, philanthropic, and academic institutions. He is the author of Irresistible Revolution, Confronting Race, Class, and the Assumptions of LGBT Politics, and Virtual Equality, the Mainstreaming of Gay and Lesbian Liberation. She currently serves as president of the Vaid Group. Ria Tobacco Marr is a senior staff attorney with the National ACLU Lesbian, Gay, Transgender, and HIV Project. Her work includes fighting attempts to use religion to discriminate against LGBTQ people at schools, at work, and in public places. Ria was part of the ACLU's litigation team in Miller versus Davis, that challenged the Kentucky court Kim Davis's refusal to issue marriage licenses after the Supreme Court's marriage equality decision, and Masterpiece Cake Shop and versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission, the case of the same-sex couple who refused a wedding cake. We are thrilled to have a student panel to speak to these two great activists. We have Cole Dempsey, a creative writing major and secretary and treasurer of the Queer Students Union, Max Pecora, who is studying music and computer science and navigating disability in life as an LGBTQ plus student on campus, and Ryan DeVita Silva, a transgender artist and vice president of Lesbians Rising at Hunter's Queer Student Union. Without further ado, Urvashi Vaid, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Our format is that we've been asked to talk for about 10 minutes, which is a dangerous thing to give a microphone to a couple of yakety lawyers. And then we're going to have a dialogue with our colleagues that's kind of open-ended for another hour or so. So thank you all for being here, and thank you, Charlie, for inviting us and for putting this event together, and thank you to the Roosevelt House. It's a beautiful space. I know we're supposed to be in a celebratory mood, but I'm in a somber mood as well, both celebratory and somber. So let me read a few remarks that I thought about for this moment, and then we'll take it away, right? So in Virtual Equality, my first book published in '95, I argued that if the LGBT movement ignored the broader dynamics of racism, economic exploitation, gender inequity, and cultural freedom, it would achieve what other civil rights movements in America have won: a partial, conditional simulacrum called equal rights, a state of virtual equality that would grant legal and formal equal rights to some parts of the community, but would not ultimately transform the institutions of society that repress, that denigrate, that immobilize sexual and gender minorities. I stand by that diagnosis. And there's many things wrong with it, too. I mean, totally open to conceding that. It's a messy book. I argued that winning equality could feel like appeasement, like being bought off by the things you want to buy, like living in a simulation which might feel mighty real inside its confines, but which ends in a return to life unchanged, like declaring victory and mission accomplished, based on a narrow definition of what winning means. I think we're living that appeasement today. In many ways, marriage is virtual equality. Marriage embodies everything that is good, great, and insufficient about equality. Marriage matters because it does matter. It does deliver meaningful rights. It does deliver tangible benefits and respect. It turns outlaws into in-laws. That's what marriage did. It transformed us. And it matters because the jurisprudence that won us the right to marry expanded the 14th Amendment again. It conceded that we have liberty and at least a few fundamental rights and the opportunity to challenge laws based on animus. Good thing. Marriage works culturally and legally because it made us legible to straight people. But marriage fails for many of the same reasons that formal legal equality as an end goal fails. It doesn't deliver justice. It doesn't transform family or culture or expand queer freedom for everybody. It doesn't end structural racism. It doesn't touch the enforcement of the gender binary. It didn't deliver reproductive justice. It didn't end familial homophobia. It didn't expand ability and access based on a disability or ability. It didn't offer much to say about ending mass incarceration and the systematic deployment of state violence against Black and brown communities. So our movement's focus on marriage, came at a cost. And that's been one of the critiques of marriage, even from people like me who are happy we have it. Because you know what? Unlike our opponents, we can have two thoughts at once. We can live in contradictions. We can live with critical thinking. So I want to say, Charlie asked us to speak briefly about some of the things that we observed that we had gained in the last 50 years. And I want to, there's so many ways to tell the stories about our movement and our histories and our successes. It's a really amazing story. I was saying to some people earlier today that you could go to any town in this country, Madison to Jackson, Mississippi, to Birmingham, Alabama, to Kalamazoo, Michigan, and you would find a queer history there. You would find people who were fighting and organizing back in the day to this day. That's an amazing, to me, that is the first, last, and most important achievement of our movement. It is decentralized, it is national, it is vibrant, it is ordinary people taking action wherever they live and wherever they experience oppression. That's number one. That is an achievement from jump. Ours is a story of resistance to state-directed violence. That's the second story over the last 50 years. Stonewall was a protest against the state. It was a protest against police brutality, actually. Police raids of gay bars were common, weekly, daily occurrences. Police harassment of patrons of gay bars, of transgender and people, of drag queens, of gender nonconforming women and men were just routine. And the violence that the police leveled against us was routine. And one might argue still is, if you look at Lambda's recent survey from a couple of years ago, where huge numbers of people report who call the police in incidents of hate violence, report themselves being subject to abuse and harassment by the police. So that's still happening. But Stonewall was a protest against the state. And I think it's important to remember that, the protest part, because I joke that, I've been active for, 40-some years, and that is nothing compared to some of the people in this room who are our elders, who I look up to, like Achebe Powell, who's been a leader and a founder of the LGBT queer movement in this country. You should know her. She's amazing, right here. But so I'm I'm just a kid in the movement, comparatively. But it's been one long protest. Every single moment in my life, I've been on the streets or railing against something, and I think that's a good thing. But the other thing is that the complicated relationship we've had to the state. That's interesting, because in the 50s and 60s, it was government out of our lives, right to privacy, stop harassing us, get out of my bedroom, government out of my life. In the 70s, it was government should grant us equal rights. Non-discrimination laws, come on, we're a minority, we deserve to be treated with respect. In the 80s, it was, why isn't the government saving our lives? We're dying. People are dying, you do nothing. We die, you do nothing. That was one of the ACT UP chants. Shep was there for many years as a leader in ACT UP, as were you. Thank you. It was amazing. It was horrible. And Queer Nation. And then we went to the 90s, was government should affirm our lives. Marriage, recognition, equality. Isn't that amazing? The span of our relationship to the state. I think it's all beautiful. I just put that out there. A couple of more observations, and then I'll turn it to Ria. So ours is definitely a story of moving from exclusion to recognition. But it's also a story that's an internal story that I value and treasure, which is a story of self-esteem. Which is, each of these are continuing stories, and I'm eager to hear from my colleagues in the younger generation of activism whether those are relevant terms even for you, Self-esteem was a big deal. coming out of shame, coming out of like developing a healthy identity, a healthy sense of self. Big deal for my generation. Not to be taken for granted. You know, you were told you were sick, you were criminal, you're sinful, you're immoral, all of that stuff, and you carried it. And we carried it into our movement, we carried it into our relationships with each other. It was a lot of horizontal hostility, if I may say so, too, you know? So I think affirming, developing like strong senses of selves and you know, coming out of familial homophobia and church homophobia and, you know, faith homophobia and government homophobia was a big deal. And then finally, I'll say that the big accomplishment of the last 50 years was political pariahs become political heavyweights. That's interesting, right? How did that happen? I mean, gosh, when I was like in my 20s and I'd graduated from college and I moved to Boston to join the movement, and that meant I meant the women's liberation movement at the time. That's the movement I wanted to join, and I did, and then I got involved in the LGBT movement in Boston. It was a big deal to get a meeting with a politician. Like, the mayor was this guy named Kevin White. Everybody was like doing cartwheels because some queer person got a meeting with the administration. You know, that's the level of outsiderness we had politically. A local mayor didn't think it was important to meet with the gay community leadership. And look at where we are today, where, you know, Mayor Pete is running for president, and that's an amazing thing. So I'll stop there and turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Charles, for having me, and it's an honor to sit here next to Urvashi. I think my starting point today, I think, is very similar in that the prompt for the session was sort of the progress we've made over the last 50 years, and in this particular moment, I'm feeling somewhat melancholy, both for extremely recent events and then just the trajectory ahead. As I was sharing with some of the students earlier, just yesterday, the Supreme Court refused to intervene in the case of Charles Rines, a man who was sentenced to death by a jury who, in choosing between a sentence of life in prison without parole and a death sentence, considered the fact that Mr. Rines is gay and held it against him. Some of the evidence that has come to light shows that a juror joked about a sentence of life in prison without parole. If he's gay, we'd be sending him where he wants to go. That was the sentiment. And the state's response to that is essentially to brush it off as a joke, which I think you all know if that's what passes as a joke. It's very telling in terms of what was on the minds of the folks in that room, even to make a joke about it, if that can be considered a joke, which I question. But even if it is a joke, so what? What does that tell us about what was at the forefront of the jurors' minds? And there were other comments as well. There was disgust expressed about the fact that Mr. Rines is gay. This was the second chance the Supreme Court had to intervene in his death sentence. They had a chance last year, and they didn't take it. And they had another chance this year with even more folks in the civil rights community weighing in to say, you have to step in here. And the court did nothing and said nothing. I think that sends a very disturbing message about the value placed on our lives at this moment in America's history, that this case of explicit bias, right? We know that bias against us plays a role in sentencing and policing, as Urvashi said, but how often do you get a case where you have jurors coming forward and saying, yes, someone said this in the jury room, and this is what was on our minds when we were deciding whether to sentence someone to life in prison or to death. This is that case. So if the court's not willing to step in and save us, where we have explicit evidence of anti-gay bias, then really what hope is there for us? Charles had suggested that I focus on perhaps 4 moments in the last 50 years, and when I look at the Supreme Court history in the area of LGBTQ cases, there have actually only been 4 victories by most conventional counts, and so that makes it fairly easy to choose the 4, although I don't think that's terrifically interesting to talk about because some of them are cases I think you all are very familiar with, like the marriage equality decision. The other thing I noticed about it is that, in looking back, the earliest victory stemmed only from 1994. So again, we're sort of looking back 50 years, which is not to say there has not been an LGBT legal movement since prior to 1994. There absolutely has been, dating back to perhaps the 1920s. I can think of the first case the ACLU filed to challenge a local ordinance that banned cross-dressing. But in terms of the Supreme Court looking at us, right, much, much shorter history, 25 years really, half that time, what we're looking at. And I wanted to start actually with the victory that probably is not one that most people think of as within the LGBT canon, but really should be, which is the case of Dee Farmer. Dee Farmer was a transgender woman who was in prison, and prison officials knew that she was transgender, and yet they put her, they didn't know what to do with her, which, by the way, is still true far too often today. They didn't know what to do with her, and they put her in protective custody, which is a nice way of saying solitary confinement, for some period of time. Again, something that happens all too often today, and eventually moved her into the general population with male prisoners, where within just a few short weeks, she was unfortunately sexually assaulted. She filed a case that got all the way to the Supreme Court on the question of, can prison officials ever be responsible for this kind of conduct, where obviously no prison official wasn't the person who had assaulted her, but they knew, right? There was a good chance they knew she was transgender. They knew she shouldn't be in general population. That's why they had her in protective custody in the first place. They kind of didn't know what to do, and so they essentially, left her there in this incredibly vulnerable spot. And Dee Farmer actually was successful in setting up a new standard where the Supreme Court says, yes, prison officials can be liable for harm to prisoners in their custody if they are deliberately indifferent. So essentially, if you subjectively know there's a risk, which in the case of a woman placed in a male prison, you know there's a risk she's going to be sexually assaulted, and you do nothing about it, you can be on the hook. Dee Farmer's case has actually been hugely important in the area of prisoners' rights. It's a foundational case in prisoners' rights, and it's the cornerstone of litigation, much of which has nothing to do with LGBT people, although it certainly also applies to LGBT people and has become increasingly relevant in recent years. And I think Dee Farmer is really an unsung hero of our movement, and so I wanted to sort of lift her up in this moment rather than spend time telling you about, Jim Obergefell and Edie Windsor, also heroes undoubtedly, but ones who I think we rightly recognize as playing a role in our legal trajectory. The other people I wanted to talk about today are Dave Mullins and Charlie Craig, the couple that were turned away by Masterpiece Cake Shop in Colorado. And I mention them for a couple of reasons. One, selfishly, they're my clients, and so I feel very close to them personally, but also because the Masterpiece decision was, I think, largely considered to be a loss by our community, and I think that's both right and wrong. And I wanted to think about what we lost and what we gained and sort of what we learned about that as we look ahead. And the next session, we think about what's coming in the Supreme Court. I think the Masterpiece decision tells us quite a bit. I think all of you are familiar with the basic facts of Masterpiece Cake Shop, which is that Dave and Charlie were engaged. This is in 2012, which again in our movement now feels like a lifetime ago, because of course in 2012 they couldn't actually get married in Colorado, which is where they live. Which feels unthinkable. The case just reached the Supreme Court last year, but of course that was true. They were planning a wedding in Provincetown and a reception back home in Colorado. And that was a very big thing. It would be today, but at that particular moment, it was a very special thing that they were able to get married anywhere. And they waited for Charlie's mom to be in town to visit a bakery and to select their wedding cake, only to be told almost as soon as they walked in the door that the bakery refused to serve same-sex couples, provide cakes for the weddings of same-sex couples. They immediately go back to the car. Charlie breaks down in tears in front of his mother, who is just heartbroken to see this happen to her son. And I think that very real shame has really largely been left out of the telling of this story, even within our own community, perhaps especially within our own community. We've had this impulse to say, it's just a cake. People are dying. It's just a cake. Why can't you go somewhere else? And of course, all of those things are true. Members of our community are dying. And there certainly are more pressing life or death problems. But at the same time, it's not an insignificant thing to be turned away because of who you are. And it's not just about wedding cakes, right? So if you can be turned away for a wedding cake, you can be turned away in any public place. You never walk about with confidence in your daily life knowing, am I welcome here? Am I free to be myself here? One thing Charlie said is that, Charlie attended college in Laramie, Wyoming, which is where Matthew Shepard was murdered, and he was no stranger to knowing when to stay closeted. But the moment when you're planning your wedding, you of course can't be closeted because the person you're marrying is right there. But also that in that moment, it was a happy moment for him. It was one of the happiest moments of his life, and it never occurred to him that was a place where it was not safe to be who he was. Even he, who obviously had the awareness we all have of knowing that we have to be constantly vigilant about keeping ourselves safe. But I think it is a very big deal for someone like Charlie to have that experience and to be turned away and to be told essentially that who he is not acceptable. The other thing that I think really is significant about the case is that the bakery, which had the support of the Trump administration in the Supreme Court, was arguing for a constitutional right to discriminate. So essentially, even though Colorado is one of 22 states that has expressly banned discrimination against us, the bakery and the Trump administration claimed that the First Amendment trumped all of that and gave them a right to turn away people who are LGBT. That is a very big deal, and although the bakery won, it did not get that broad constitutional right to discriminate. So essentially, Justice Kennedy expressed concerns about procedural ways the case had been handled at the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, which did give the bakery a free pass for its discrimination against Dave and Charlie, and that's incredibly disappointing, in particular because I think the case was reported as a victory for the bakery, and that then emboldens other businesses to discriminate in precisely this way. But that's not actually what the court said was okay. If you really read the decision, you'll see that, at the end of the day, every business in Colorado, including Masterpiece Cake Shop, still has to serve LGBT people on equal terms as heterosexual people. And there's a great deal of language in the opinion that talks about the significance of non-discrimination laws to our ability to go about day-to-day life. It's funny that, Urvashi started from the premise of, what is legal equality? And so I certainly agree that it's not everything. I'm curious, maybe in the conversation we talk about whether you think formal equality is sort of a necessary step on the path to lived equality. Yes. So yes, necessary but not sufficient. But the court really got it, that this is how we go about our daily lives. Imagine if you walk out the front door and you don't know, whether you're going to be welcome at a store, a restaurant, a bank, a hotel. That is not sort of, that's something that many of us are fortunate enough to take for granted. And it's something that's equally important to LGBT people. And I think just the sort of recognition in passing that this ability the freedom to participate fully in civic life that the court has recognized expressly in the context of race discrimination and sex discrimination, the court also recognized applies to LGBT people. And almost, said with some sort of caveat, like it's incontrovertible that, this right is important. That's a really big deal. The court for the first time, I think, really recognized that the same rules that applied to laws banning race discrimination and sex discrimination should apply and do apply to us too. So I'll stop there, and I'm very, very curious to talk more and hear what people want to hear about.
Okay. Okay, this is on. Cool. So I want to acknowledge first that I feel like the courts wouldn't fully be able to get that in-depth understanding of LGBTQ rights and how we all function on our day-to-day lives without amicus briefings that lawyers as in-depth and as thoroughly as you guys will go out and send to the courts themselves. So I was just wondering about the process of sending, being a friend of the court and sending out information and what you guys consider on a case-to-case basis, especially considering the Masterpiece Cake Shop case and also the Kim Davis case, and what exactly was pertinent in those briefings versus things that were kind of not as pertinent.
Sure, I'll take the first pass at it. So amicus briefs obviously are hugely important in giving the court additional perspectives that can't fit in the party briefs, and also providing an outlet for other voices. So just to pick up on two cases that I already talked about, in the case of Charles Rines, the ACLU actually filed an amicus brief in the Supreme Court in that case on behalf of a number of LGBT groups, including Lambda Legal and HRC, to sort of lay out the history of discrimination against LGBT people. One of the main reasons that South Dakota had argued there should be no examination into bias in the jury room, which typically is, or in recent history, has been allowed only in the context of race discrimination. If evidence of race discrimination in jury deliberations comes forward, then there can be an inquiry. Even that, by the way, just a few years old. The reason South Dakota said, well, this can't apply to anti-gay discrimination too, is they have this great passage, no president has ever said he'll build a wall to keep out LGBT people, right? Yeah, okay, the Immigration and Nationality Act did that for him until, 1992, 1991, yeah, right? We were not allowed to enter the country. Non-citizens, LGBT non-citizens, were not allowed to enter the country until the 1990s. So one of the things we felt it was really important to do was to show the history of discrimination against us, not to say that it's the same as race discrimination, because it isn't, right? Discrimination based on race in this country is unique, particularly a history of anti-Black racism. But the fact that other forms of discrimination are unique doesn't mean that the court should stand by and let discrimination against us go unchecked. And we felt it was really necessary to sort of spell that out. That's something that, of course, counsel for Mr. Rines, it's an argument they touched on in their brief, didn't have the space to just catalog line by line, oh, and another thing, oh, and another thing, barred from military service, barred from public employment, barred from private employment, barred from the country, subject to police raids, institutionalized, castrated.
Yeah, there's only so many things that I guess you could fit in a court document then.
And we were not the only folks to file amicus briefs in that case. There was a very powerful brief filed by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which I think, again, spoke with authority on this question that that the rule that you can look into evidence of juror bias should not be limited to race discrimination. That's a message that I think, again, obviously Mr. Rines wanted to get before the court, but the civil rights organizations can speak with authority on that. So I think amicus briefs can.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna add because like it's all intersectional too. So like to exclude one would to say that like, oh, if you're both things, that like half of you almost doesn't count either. Like, or that like one of the groups that you're a part of gets less gets less protection than the other, I guess, and that's just not. It's not a balance that works in a legal perspective where it's like it needs to be. I'm gonna stop talking now.
And just to pick up, I was going to say, there were over 100 amicus briefs filed in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, so I can't even begin to summarize all of them. One in particular that I think was really, really moving was a brief filed by Lambda Legal, which was just stories of LGBT people who'd been turned away because of who they are, including a man in Mississippi whose husband passed away, and the funeral home actually came and refused to transport the body once they realized that he had a same-sex surviving spouse. So again, not about wedding cakes, and very, very important to put that in context, and again, put more stories forward than just the couple that were parties to the actual case.
Pardon me. We talk a lot about the progress of legal rights for LGBTQ plus people, but in doing so, I'd like to speak something that's like very near and dear to me, which is unfortunately, and like I preface this by saying I'm only just about to turn 22, so I am very young, but it's like for most of my life and for most of the movement at large, the rights of certain people, at least it seems that the rights of certain members of the movement have been privileged above others. And in my case, for example, it's like, and speaking from a personal standpoint, for example, the rights of trans people. Unfortunately, often the rights of trans people are often put aside in favor of other things. And earlier you were speaking of marriage. And I remember recently I was reading Sarah McBride's autobiography. And in it, she mentions that in Delaware, when they were attempting to legalize same-sex marriage, originally part of that bill was additional legal language pertaining to the rights of trans people to use public facilities. However, that part of the legal language was essentially used as a kind of bargaining chip and was later removed to achieve marriage equality, which on the one hand, that's a very good thing to have, but unfortunately it came at the cost of trans people. So I guess my discussion, interesting to hear your opinions on, is how do you feel about the history of how, for example, trans rights have been sort of overshadowed in favor of rights such as marriage equality? Because, for example, a lot of things pertaining to trans rights, the legality of trans rights, have been more recent. For example, gender just passed a few months ago. So, pardon me, I'm a little bit nervous.
Doing great.
So yeah, I was just curious to hear about your opinions as people who have worked.
You make a really, really important point that everybody needs to remember, which is that that all parts of our communities haven't experienced the same level of advancement, or are not. It's an uneven development, as they say in the economic realm, and the story that comes to mind as you're sharing the story about trans people and trans rights is people need, as recently as the 1996 or 7, during the Clinton administration, there was a window there where some members of Congress and some people in the DC community absolutely felt that a federal gay rights bill could pass. Or could be, maybe it wouldn't pass, but it was going to be advanced. There could have been hearings, it could have passed the House. I can't remember whether we controlled the House or the Senate, one of them. And so there was this real push. And it was a trans-exclusive bill. And remember? And at the time, she's a woman who most of you will never know her name, but there was a woman named Carrie Lobel, who was the executive director of the national, then called National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. And she put down a marker. She said, if there is a trans-exclusionary bill that is introduced, we, the task force, will lobby against it. You should have heard the hate mail that she got. I was working at the task force again at the time. I had worked there in the 80s. I left and wrote a book. I came back to run a think tank because Carrie invited me to do that. And I was living in New York and she was in DC. Oh my God, like people were like, how dare you? People canceled their membership. They called her up to yell at her. Like you're betraying our movement. Why wouldn't you want gay rights to pass in Congress? We've wanted this bill forever. It would change millions of people's lives. And she took the position, all of us or none of us. She said, one of our arguments was, if the other side was saying, well, look, we'll get to that later. And she said, well, we won't get to that later. It'll take us another 20 years to get to that, and that's not okay. So fast forward to today, the Equality Act, all those people who were like, no, it'll never happen, no, never, never, it's done. What that moment of refusal did was, stand with a community that was organizing, even back then, was tinier, the trans movement was smaller, but it was there, different organizations actually. And then it stood with those organizations, it empowered, it like elevated them to a different position of like, okay, we need to work together to define a bill that's gonna work. And a lot of people started working on a trans-inclusive thing called ENDA, right? It became the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and now it's become the Equality Act, which I'd love to hear about your views on the religious exemption, but that's another issue, and that bill. But you make a really important point, but I think that because of the leadership of trans people in each era of our movement, there's been a challenge made to not around gender identity and gender expression, and now it's like non-binary, beyond trans even, right? In some ways, right? To say trans, gender non-conforming, non-binary. And I think that's extraordinary. And I think when you hear it being expressed in as a matter of course on TV news we're fighting a bitter fight all over the country on the bodies of trans people. But that fight is actually expanding freedom and possibility. So yes, their movement didn't do certain things and some people in the movement, but there were others who did fight with, always.
Okay. Great. I just want to thank everyone that's spoken previously. It's an honor to be able to be here, to be able to speak. And everything that's been brought up at this point has been so important to speak about. And speaking about the way that people are left behind, speaking about this expansion, you mentioned, the year 1996. Now, October 26th of that year, somewhere within the depths of Brooklyn was where I was born. And less than 200 miles away from there, outside of Johns Hopkins Medical Center, there was a protest going on between a couple of different groups for the rights of children who were born in a more ambiguous state to protest against forced surgeries. And it was really the first recognized movement that was an intersex-specific protest. And we celebrate that now as Intersex Day of Awareness. And here I am, that's my birthday, that's my cause. And getting to know how things are within this community, getting to know the history of how things have been shared as siblings and how things have also resulted in one group pushing at the rights of another group, resulting in people feeling that their rights are being infringed on when other people are given rights that aren't taking anything from them because of the way that they see this. When there's outside forces, there was the famous David Reimer case, and there was the doctor, John Money, who decided that, let's show that we can just raise a kid completely different. We can train gender. Didn't work. Of course, they never really spoke about the fact that that didn't work, but they used this as a point to then force further surgeries onto intersex children, intersex infants. And this is bathed in blood, and the only silver lining that has come from this is that it was able to advance confirmation surgeries for people who are trans who need these surgeries. And that's such a painful point, knowing that this has created something wonderful and that it's been taken from something terrible. We have so many things like that. We have the history of how Planned Parenthood started. We have... The point is that every movement is built on the backs of people who have fought and who have bled and who have died for this. And for us to then turn around and start to exclude all of those people that we have built upon, for us to be excluded as people who know that we have been, as a group, builders. We're all in this as one large dysfunctional family. And to be able to see this happening, to see how much work has to be done, and to know that I have amazing people that are part of this family with me. It gives me hope, but it also just gives me such anger knowing how much further we could have gone if there weren't forces attempting to divide from within and without.
I wondered if I could prevail upon Achebe to say a few words about this particular struggle of inclusion or anything you want to talk about, because I think you're amazing.
You were saying, so I'm not quite sure in terms of the point that you're making, but there is no other way forward, and has not been since I came out, stepped into claiming myself fully as a lesbian woman, but as a Black lesbian woman, saying to all of those around me, because I came out at 32, my goodness, I've landed on the same point that I landed when I joined the Black Civil Rights Movement. The struggle is on. I've landed on the same point that I landed on when I joined the women's movement. The struggle is on. And when I came out as a lesbian, I said, just show me the soapbox, because the movement is on. I say that in terms of the integration, in terms of inclusion, the integration of myself. Audre Lorde used to say when people would ask her, well, how do you feel most, discriminated against as a woman, as a Black person, as a lesbian? And she would say, when I walk through that room, do you see the woman part come in, the Black part come in, the lesbian? So there is a natural and integrated sense in myself and people like Audre Lorde of inclusion. There is no other way to go. Starting in the 74, I guess, was the first time that I stepped onto the platform. I made this statement, and I made this statement then 1,000 times afterwards. I cannot stand up here and talk to you about the lesbian gay liberation movement. And at that time, we were saying gay liberation movement, and sitting in the boardroom of the National Gay Task Force, pounding on the desk to say, when we talk about the inclusion, the L that belongs in here, we are present. It took us 3 years. It took me becoming the chair of the board of directors to establish a women's caucus within the National Gay Task Force, 1974 through 1978. To meet prior to every board meeting, the Women's Caucus, to set our agenda very clear, to make sure that it was integrated into the whole. So when I would say to people, I cannot talk just about the lesbian and gay movement, I must talk about the intersection. And we didn't use the word intersection at that time, but I must talk about the linkages between the lesbian gay movement, and that, again, was our limitation at that time. We were saying lesbian gay movement, the women's liberation movement, and the Black civil rights struggle for me. So when I hear us, fast forward 50 years later, and we have come a long way, LGBTQI, gender nonconforming, etc. Each step of the way, somebody was pounding on the desk to say, yes and, not yes but, yes and, yes and, yes and, yes and. And so the struggle goes on. And I would like to say that instead of the notion of, I can't frame your own experience for you, that somehow there's a conscious decision to simply privilege one group over another within the movement. It was about the learning curve and the consciousness, especially on the part of the leaders, that was so important. And a leader like a Carrie LaBelle, who could step forward and say, everybody, come on, this is the way that we're going. And of course, so many people, resisting it in all kinds of ways. But now you've got me going, and I need to step back now because it's not anything really. There's so much that we could say. There are questions that I have. Actually, it's like a non sequitur, but I'm very curious, Ria, why you didn't include Lawrence v. Texas in your moments. For us, again, in terms of the standing on the soapbox, and I'm seeing myself outside of with the Hilton Hotel. The Supreme Court justices were having some kind of huge meeting there, and we're standing on the soapbox and saying, and I took this from Flo Kennedy. I'm all over the place with you guys, but follow me. Flo Kennedy, who had just spoken, and those of you who don't know Flo Kennedy, she was one bad sister. I mean, a bad mother. Black, lesbian, lawyer, very connected with ran with Gloria Steinem in cahoots, and just was up to all kinds of devilishment. And when she spoke to us at a Black women's conference in Boston, said, I am going to be so outrageous, they won't be able to contain me so that you guys can be just a little less, swinging from the chandeliers. But Flo Kennedy, a few weeks before this time, had spoken to a big rally that was just outside of Madison Square Garden because the Democratic Party was meeting. And at that time, we were dealing with Howard B. Bowers, again, trying to have the right to be in our bedrooms doing what we want to do with the person that we love. That got struck down. But Lawrence v. Texas, flipped that on its side. In the meantime, what we're doing then on the streets, yelling, screaming in front of the Hilton Hotel, I am then mimicking Florence, who had turned to, in her speech, to the New York City police who were lined up along outside of Madison Square Garden in the Democratic Convention, and said to them, you tell the bishop that the Catholic Church needs to get out of the fucking business. The fucking business is not your business. Get out. I mimicked her a couple of weeks later to the Supreme Court justices because we're still trying to get them out of the fucking business because it is not your business. And so, again, the stories are just could come and keep flowing. And in terms of the theme that is here, the inclusion is, to me, has to be a given, and at the same time, we have to fight for it. My sadness, and I'll just close with this. My sadness that I still hold is, and Urvashi, you worked with this in one of your earlier talks about why can't the movement now, our LGBTQI, gender nonconforming, our movement be smart enough to see what it would be to actually make broad coalitions with other movements in very, very intentional ways and put it out. The NAACP sends an amicus brief, along with many, many others, but we need to be sending our amicus briefs to You know, the folks who are fighting about the burning, burning of 3 black churches in Louisiana, the burning of the Highlander Center. The LGBT movement needs to be going, you know, what? What the heck? Not on our watch, kind of thing. That's one of my sad pieces, that piece hasn't been sufficiently understood how powerful that could be for our movement, just from a selfish point of view. Can you imagine how that would accelerate our movement to be in total solidarity with the Black Civil Rights Movement, with the, you know, the immigrant rights movement in ways that are, that haven't been done before? Urvashi, you start.
I did. I did. You see why. Thank you.
I do have to say thank you so much for your time, and everything that you said was spectacular, and just thank you so much for coming. I also wanted to turn to the point that we originated with the idea of state-sanctioned violence, and I feel almost as if, as a facilitator of an LGBTQ space, that while we fight for these rights, an emphasis, at least in my organization, has been put on maintaining the rights that we already have. And it's almost like we aren't fighting a linear battle, but every spot that we gain, every inch of ground that we gain, we have to continuously fight to maintain. And I do have to say that as far as state-sanctioned violence, that is far from a thing from the past, especially now considering the epidemic and the crisis of Black trans women being abused by police, among other people. And it's just, I am extremely saddened to know that this is a reality in a world where people in my broad community that I support as an ally, that they can't get the same courtesy that I would get. And I just feel really saddened about that. And Rye, if you want to jump in on how you feel about this issue, I'm more than happy to let you add your own personal.
Well, it's like, specifically for Black trans women, it's like living at the intersex of being Black and being trans and being a woman. It's like I read this statistic that was something like 80% of all trans women who are murdered are Black. So yeah, it's like there does need to be attention paid to these people who are often, for lack of a better word, shit upon and ignored very much by greater society, but also by a lot of other members in the movement. But on the positive side, I am happy that in more recent years there has been an extreme degree of strides in recognizing those stories. Like recently, of course, there was Pose, which is groundbreaking representation. A cast that's almost entirely trans women of color. And the fact that it's like, on the one hand, it's like we do need to pay attention to the tribulation, but on the other hand, it's like I'm happy that there is at least some modicum of attention now, and there's not only that, but now a celebration of these individuals. They're going to be the Grand Marshals of Pride. It's like that's just sort of my 2 cents.
And that's about the power of culture to help accelerate and transform people's thinking about us and our communities. And I think that the trans movement's work has been really amazing. When I see the movement for Black Lives embracing a trans-inclusive frame, or the immigrant rights movement, I mean, it's a new day around intersectional politics. And I think, and that's what I would say, Achebe, that the sadness should lift a little bit, because the emerging movements are at a whole other level. They have internalized the Combahee River Collective Statement from 1977, and they're operating from it. That was my operating principle. That was my, OS. The Combahee River Collective Statement from 1977 was oh, this is what I was looking for theoretically to live my life and practice my politics. It was all about inclusion, and it's centered on women of color. and but it like extended to everything. And so I'm very heartened, like you too, despite the bleak moments, and there's so many, that there's like this incredible wave of people who are fighting. And I really appreciate what you said, that every generation has to pound that table. And we got to remember that, because power does not yield without a demand. And people who are powerful, whether you know, and my question for you was, I heard upstairs you're running for city government. I mean, you're in student government.
Hopefully
City government one day. But currently
We can only
student
hope.
government, and in a heated fight around where one of the key issues is transgender, gender-neutral bathrooms at Hunter. Is that right?
Yeah, so I'm running with a new slate for the undergraduate student government at Hunter, and we have been using some of the pushes that the QSU as an organization has been pushing for as a way to try and facilitate more change, more LGBT inclusive change. The gender neutral bathrooms is a more obvious one that I absolutely want to get done, because we only have one gender neutral bathroom on campus, and currently it isn't being maintained to an extent where it can be used by the entire student populace. Like, bathrooms need to be functional. Yeah, we actually have a hole in the ceiling of our club room that's currently sprinkling, I guess, lightly, building materials into our room. And we've been sending out work order requests almost generationally. The club has been around, it's the longest running club on Hunter's campus. And we've been sending in work order requests for it, and it hadn't gotten fixed or updated since Andrew and I announced our candidacy. So we're kind of here to pound on the table a little bit. We want more change, and that also includes we want to see if it's possible to catalog preferred names and pronouns and put them on professor sign-in sheets, so people are aware, and it makes the information more accessible without treating our non-binary and transgender students like second-class students, I guess. But those are two policy changes that, should I get elected, I am holding it very close to my heart, and that is going to be my personal push. And I only see going up from there. I only see more LGBT inclusive policy on campus, and hopefully we make Hunter a more open and accessible school for all kinds of people within the community. But yeah.
I'm so happy to hear you raise facilities, because it's something we haven't talked about thus far, and it feels like a glaring omission in this session in terms of the major issues today. And one thing I did want to flag is that obviously facilities have always been an issue for trans and gender nonconforming people, but we have seen a real uptick, and at least in terms of state efforts to regulate facilities use, since the decision in Obergefell recognizing marriage equality for same-sex couples. And I just wanted to recognize and name sort of the flip side of a dynamic that Rai talked about earlier, which is that, you know, with a victory, when we have a victory that makes visible certain members of our community, same-sex couples, for example, and we have not done the same work to make visible and to lift up people who are trans, it's the most vulnerable members of our community who feel the backlash. And so, you know, in the months and years following the Obergefell decision, we certainly have seen some backlash towards LGBT people, but the worst backlash really has been towards trans people, because we did not lay the groundwork to really center trans voices. And it's taken that backlash, I think, for much of sort of, you know, big LGBT, the sort of big groups. And I, by the way, I include my own among them. So I'm not, you know, saying we don't deserve blame here. I think we all bear responsibility for this. It's taken those attacks to really get much of our sort of mainstream movement to realize the need to center trans voices, not just as props, but actually as leadership and as movement architects. Because if we don't do that, then we are setting ourselves up for these kinds of fights where, you know, you win marriage, and then the following state legislative session, what do we see? We see state legislators trying to legislate where trans children can use the bathroom in response to the marriage equality decision, because those are the people in our community who they think are the most vulnerable, and they're recognizing, you know, we've not had those people's backs. That is changing, which I think is a good thing. But that has been, I think, a very unfortunate but necessary wake-up call.
Thank you. No, that's a great point, and I want to thank you, and I want to thank Cole especially. I know that Cole has been fighting, Andrew has been fighting their entire slate has been fighting tooth and nail to find some sort of recognition. Many of the students within the opposing party, which is the incumbent party there, have sort of taken this approach of going off of, hey, we're friendly, we have free pancakes. And we've had this vicious fight now going on within social media, which I've found myself partially at the forefront of because I don't shut up about having a disability. I will not shut up about having a disability. I can't forget that I have a disability. I need a goddamn cane to get around. And part of the issue with that is that our campus is having such issues with elevators. We now have, the QSU is located in Thomas Hunter Hall, which is not where these elevator issues are happening, but where another issue is happening where we used to have a wheelchair accessible ramp, and the entrance for that is closed. They have an asbestos abatement going on. They have all sorts of construction going on for even more fun things that we don't really need going on. But the one entrance that wasn't through a labyrinth in the basement would be through this north building with these terrible elevators to this hall that's supposed to be accessible, that has a chairlift that can barely support a person, let alone a wheelchair, that has a now automatic door that isn't automatic at all. Okay, great. So what do we do with that? Where do we go with that when people are more concerned with how they look?
You know where you go? New York City Human Rights Commission.
I'm 3 seconds away from it.
The office of Corey Johnson. Use the voice that we have. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, I appreciate that so much because there's this feeling of not knowing what to do. And I want to get back to that initial point that you'd made about shame and about self-image, because there's so much of that. Every time that I speak up in here, we had people posting moving images from this other slate twice that were non-epilepsy friendly, and I luckily have mild symptoms of it, but someone else within the group messaged me to thank me for demanding that they take these down because she has epilepsy. And she was only saved from having an epileptic seizure because her phone didn't automatically play a GIF. And that shouldn't be a thought on people's heads to post some sort of bright flashing image when you're saying that, oh, you care about disabled students, that you care about your disabled student body. That shouldn't be happening. And I shouldn't have to go in there and demand for an apology multiple times. It shouldn't be happening, and I've gotten one. And then I had this whole crisis last night of, am I saying too much? Am I doing too much? Am I being horrible about this? And I had that same battle thinking about speaking on this panel, because I sit here, I desperately tried to just get through my life and not be injured or discriminated against. And I often don't speak about the fact that I'm intersex, that I have an intersex condition. I don't speak about all of the things that I've gone through with that unless I know I'm around safe company where I can. And that creates this whole thing of how can I advocate for this group that has such a small voice. We had this bill that had to be pushed back because doctors are still convinced that for some strange reason, they and parents should have more say in the bodies of intersex children than the people that are attached to those body parts. And so how do I advocate when I'm trying to hide this part of myself? And then I have issues that intersect, issues that I never thought that I would struggle with, because in my family, being gay was fine. I mean, my great uncle passed away from AIDS before I got to meet him. And on that side of the family as well, my grandfather's cousin was part of the push here before gay marriage was legalized to put legislature in place, to put something in place so that she and her spouse and every other same-sex spouse could have equal rights within the DOA, because she worked in education and they didn't have those same benefits as any other couple. They weren't lesser. And somehow they didn't have those rights until they'd fought. They banged on the tables. I need to bang on those same tables, and I'm trying so hard to find it within myself, to find my self-worth that. And I have something at least to fight for. I've found other people to fight for, even if I can't find it within me to fight for myself. I have an amazing partner, and I never thought that homophobia was something that was going to come so strongly into my life, but while my family accepts that, his does not. And that is something that I've had to relearn, that this is still something going on, and there's more intersections there. And I mean, there are things you don't even think will come up. There's parts that are also just part of this movement that are smaller. I'm sorry, I'm so out of this. I know I'm sort of rambling at this point, but
Actually,
thank
you're
you.
making a lot of sense. And
I'm glad that what I'm saying is being conveyed. There's all of these different parts that make up me, and then another part of this that has intersected with my life in so many different nonsensical ways is then having this whole clause of asexuality, which is its own different creature, which is its own different. This isn't something that people go out and are beaten up for or are locked up for. And then at the same time, you look for some sort of research, and you're finding things like, oh, is this actually real? Or is it, still a disorder? Are we still getting to that? And then I come back to this, and where this intersects in my life is where I'm sitting in an endocrinologist's office being asked, oh, who are you interested in? And then being grilled on this part of my life. This is not who I'm here to see. I'm not here to talk therapy about this part of my sexuality because you haven't encountered this before. I'm not a lab rat. This is not a lab rat. This is not a lab rat. Last time I checked, I'm pretty human, I think. And it just amazes me that all these little things come back, all these little things that I never expected. I never expected my own mother to all but torture me about that part of my orientation. I expected her not to like that I liked men. She was fine with it. I mean, I guess everyone in my family was fine with it. I was dancing to Shania Twain on the couch when I was around 5, so I guess they kind of knew. But there's shame. There's shame in speaking about this right now, because I'm thinking in my head there are things that are so much more important. Push this aside. Talk about those. And I think in my head, who am I to represent all of these things when there's so much else that needs to be spoken about? What gets that time? And this is something in our entire community. Who gets the time to be up there? Who gets the time to speak? And the thing is, every time, this was my point that I think you didn't catch before because I'm somehow terrible at using microphones. But my point is that every time that we divide, and every time we divide from within and without, something is lost. Some of that time that could be spent lifting one another up is lost to tearing each other down and sort of making a hierarchy of, well, this has to be taken care of first, so we have to get these people out, but then, oh, we've been here longer, so clearly we should be, at the forefront, but, oh, this is a brand new thing that nobody knows about, well, let's get this out. And then there's infighting. Ridiculous amounts of infighting when there shouldn't be. We don't have the time or the strength or the energy to devote to infighting. That can't be happening. We can't be at a place where we're attacking members of our community that have different faiths because we think that, oh, well, this certain faith is associated with an institution that has oppressed us. but we have to understand how much this is a part of their experience and history and their life, and give them the power to have both. Don't make them choose. Don't make them choose between advocating for themselves in terms of discrimination on their orientation or on their gender or on their race. Don't make them choose. There are enough people out there making them choose already.
I think that's an extremely solid and extremely eloquently put point. Would you like to open the conversation up to work in the community concerning intersex peoples, especially considering how oftentimes it's forgotten in the community that we have people who are in the more extended part of the acronym, that they're equally as important and they need to be advocated for as well, and they need to have their voices recognized.
Sure, I'll start. So that's a great question, and I just want to say that, not all people with intersex conditions identify as LGBTQ, so there is also that tension of wanting to be good allies and also recognizing that just because someone has an intersex condition does not mean that they are a part of our community as well. I think something Max touched on, that it's true that even in places that are sort of the most progressive jurisdictions in the country, California, for example, introduced but not passed this year a bill to prohibit non-consensual genital surgeries on infants born with intersex conditions until the child is old enough to consent themselves. Incredible that in 2019 this is where we are, and sort of, the way you can tell you're in a progressive place is that a bill of that kind even could be introduced, right, not passed, whereas in other places, of course, there's no real consideration given to ending those sort of non-consensual surgeries. But this has not been, I'll just say frankly, this has not been part of sort of most of the big LGBT legal movement. There are groups that focus on working with people with intersex conditions, and Interact is probably the most prominent in the legal space, and they're doing terrific work, which I would really want to lift up. Most of our work has been more in the legislative space, trying to sort of lay the groundwork for bills that can prohibit surgeries, recognizing, of course, that this is the tip of the iceberg, but it's a very, very critical one.
And I would add that the I think it's been intersex activists who educated me, starting with Cheryl Chase. I remember that 1994 protest at Johns Hopkins, or 1996. Yeah, Cheryl was one of the founders of the first intersex organization and went around everywhere, did one-on-ones with everybody. Absolutely was like a ferocious, tenacious, kind educator all at once, and talking and educating and opening people's eyes. And the hard thing to me is that not only is it a legal issue, it's a personal, as you really eloquently framed, an issue of shame and coming out about being intersex, about it's family-based, so you have all of that stuff to contend with. But it's also about the medical profession, which is accorded so much authority and control over our lives, and which as queer people, LGBTQIA, every one of us has experienced this kind of relationship with the medical community that has been problematic, and we've had to fight back against their judgment of us, their evaluation of us. Even today, I think gender dysphoria, what? That you have to get that classification in order to qualify for surgery is a step that we have to change over the next period of our work, right? So that, why does it have to be a condition, right? And so I think there's so much depth in what you have shared, and I think the challenge that you're offering for us to take about speaking, inclusively, but also not dividing, is really powerful to me too. It was another dimension of what you shared that I really related to. And yeah, I think, shame is something we don't talk a lot about. We talk about trauma right now in our movement a lot, but there's this other dimension of how it makes you feel when you're experience trauma, right? And shame was a lot what we talked about coming up, but it was, so there's a real lot of deep conversations that are happening in our communities right now. Like, I have learned a lot from this trauma conversation that many of my younger friends have brought to me, you know, because they're steeped in this thinking about it and a self-awareness that, you know, I think my generation was sometimes just a blunt instrument. You know, we were like pounding at that door of mainstream institutions, and I think sometimes we truly lacked sensitivity towards each other and to ourselves. We were not necessarily kind to ourselves. You know, when you carry all that stuff in you of racism and, you know, all those legacies in each of our bodies, and that's what I meant by the horizontal hostility, that I've seen it expressed in so many painful ways. I probably perpetuated it too against, you know, my fellow comrades in moments. So I think there's a lot to be learned from what you just shared. Thank you.
Charlie, where are we?
We have time for one question from the audience.
Why don't we take the two questions and we'll try to do our justice to them? How about that?
I have a question. I hope it doesn't upset anybody. But I have a question. You said that not all intersex people are part of the LGBT movement. In other words, some of them are just straight, I guess you're saying.
Well, I've said not all people with intersex conditions identify as LGBT.
Right, they just-
We as LGBT people may wish to welcome people with intersex
Right.
conditions in our movement, but it's, you know, not
Was
for
that
us
true
to
with
name.
trans people? There might be some trans people who transition and then just want to be a suburban housewife. I mean, like Christine Jorgensen, the first one I ever heard of. There was no trans community. I don't know that much, not much of one, but she just wanted to become a woman. She got a kid, adoption, and she lives her life as a woman. I
There are
mean,
lots of
so she's
lesbians
not really
who just
part of
want
our.
to be a suburban housewife too. I mean, I think you're getting at the point that obviously all of us have a sexual orientation, and all of us have a gender
No,
identity.
I know,
and-
but
Wait.
she's really not part of our community.
I-
Looking back, because she just. Became,
Well,
I don't know.
but who gets to decide whether she's
Well,
part of our
she's
community?
kind of decided by not becoming part of. I
If
don't know. I didn't know Christine actually.
if I may, what's your name?
Shep.
Shep. Hi, nice to meet you. Just to very quickly speak about that, it's very true that within every single subgroup, you will find people that don't want to align themselves with the community. That is always going to be a thing. There will always be people who don't see this as part of their identity, mainly because they don't want to see this as part of their identity, because they want to be seen as themselves first. And for some people, that means boxing this away. And for other people, that means when they can't, or they don't want to, or they're not willing to, that this is for them. And the point of all of these groups being together is that all of these groups are welcome to be together, even if there's someone who says, oh, I just want to be a housewife, even if there's someone who says, oh, I just want to be a lumberjack out in the woods. I don't want to deal with society at all. The point is that all of these groups as a whole, whether or not individuals within them do this, that's all that it is.
Thank you. An offer and a quick question. I can connect you, Hunter students, with the Chief of Staff for Corey Johnson. I'm happy to get your info and chat after, and that as well. My question, it may be peculiar, but you put the seed in my thinking about Dee Farmer. When you spoke about the finding for that case, you know that there's a risk. Did the folks lose yesterday because they didn't argue that as an established precedent?
So doctrinally, the two cases are separate, but you're absolutely right to draw a link. I mean, there's a thread that goes through all of these cases, and the question came up earlier about Lawrence v. Texas, and when I made a glib comment earlier that we've only had 4 gay rights victories, so Lawrence certainly is among them. So I haven't forgotten Romer, Lawrence, Windsor, and Obergefell, right? Just a record. Maybe I should have said that. That's it. That's what we got. And by the way, and I say gay rights victories because, of course, those are all gay rights victories. They're cases involving gay people, and all but Romer also involve same-sex couples, right? Not even single gay people, but same-sex couples. A very subset of our community, but nonetheless, those are the victories. I think in Charles Rines' case, the issue really was, as I said, that it's only been recently that the court has recognized that we can inquire into juror bias even when it comes to race discrimination. And now this question comes, which was the same question in Romer, really, which is, are the same rules that apply to everyone else going to apply to us too, or is there going to be a different set of rules? That, I think, really is a thread that runs through all of these decisions, right? Romer, of course, is the case involving Colorado's Amendment 2, where Colorado passed a law saying you cannot have a local non-discrimination ordinance that protects LGBT people, right? And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. You know, LGBT people, gay people, right, have the same ability to access the political process as everyone else. So they're not saying we have to be protected, but they're also saying you can't take us out of this equation and say there's nothing you can do to get protection. You still, right, you have an equal opportunity to fight. You can try. You can try. You may not win, but you can try along with everyone else. And I think in many ways Charles Rines' case raises that same question, right? We've come up with a rule that says when we have express evidence of juror bias, right, this violates a principle. Chief Justice Roberts said it a couple of years ago, that a fundamental premise of our criminal legal system, that our law punishes people for what they do, not who they are. When we have evidence that that is not what happened, right, we have to look into it. Again, doesn't mean you win. It means you get a hearing to bring that evidence forward. And the question really in Charles Rines' case is, are we going to apply that same rule to LGBT people too? Now, the court ducked it, right? So they may still yet reach it another day, and I hope they will. But they had an opportunity to say, yes, the same rules apply to us too, and they didn't take it, and you know, a man's life is on the line.
Hi, I'm Linda Fraser, and I worked in the mental hygiene industry, as it were, for many years. And I just wanted to expand on what Urvashi said, and also what Achebe is saying about banging on the table. I think it's really important that we remember that homosexuality was only kind of gradually removed out of the DSM manual, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders, with a lot of shouting. And at that time, and up until today, transgender has not been removed. The DSM-5, we're still fighting for that. So, and that's a really important place, because when you have illness as an underpinning for your revolution, people are still thinking law does not change. Law and legislation does not change the heart or the mind of what people remember. So that it's really important that you continue that fight, because we no longer, the department no longer interacts with the community. So, you know, that's a fight that needs to continue.
This is not a question, since we have,
have
just
the last
an
word.
announcement.
You can have the last
Yes,
word.
all right. It's just an announcement in terms of beyond same-sex marriage. You know, what we do tomorrow night at CLAGS, CUNY Graduate Center, some panel of very, very brilliant, passionate activists will be revisiting this whole thing of what next after same-sex marriage. These were the same people whom, probably 5 or 6 years before we actually got the marriage equality, I facilitated a weekend retreat, which was called Beyond Same-Sex Marriage, and we created a statement out of that. And so we're back to looking at that again. So if anybody's interested, that would be a really wonderful panel.
Urvashi, Rhea, Cole, Max, and Rye, thank you for a magnificent panel.